Welcome, everyone, to Gramercy Books Author Night, featuring science and environmental journalist Kale Williams in conversation with climate expert Jason Cervenec. Tonight, we're featuring The Loneliest Polar Bear, a true story of survival and peril on the edge of a warming world. Kale's informative and heartfelt portrayal of the Arctic in distress. At the center of his page-turning narrative is an abandoned polar bear cub named Nora, whose uncertain future in the accelerating climate crisis is closely tied to our own. The Loneliest Polar Bear was released in March by the Crown imprint of Penguin Random House. Tonight's program is timely. The EPA just released new data showing how global warming is making life harder for Americans in myriad ways that threaten their health and safety, their homes and communities. I want to thank the Bird, Polar, and Climate Research Center at The Ohio State University, who is Gramercy's community partner for tonight's program. I'm Linda Cass. We are live streaming this program tonight through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Kale and Jason will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. That will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes for your questions submitted in the Q&A box. You'll find that icon for the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or laptop, or at the top of your screen on other devices. This is where Jason will be taking your questions for Kale during the latter portion of this program. You can write your questions into this box at any time during the program. And actually, it's good to do so because those questions liked by many others will be upvoted, which means they'll rise to the top of the Q&A box, most likely to be asked. Another tool many of you are familiar with is the chat box, and this allows you to chat among yourselves, but I just want to emphasize that this will not be monitored by the panelists. That icon also is at the bottom of your desk or laptop screen. We hope your chats don't distract you from what will be an intriguing conversation tonight. I want to draw your attention, though, now for a moment to the chat box. So click onto that icon. It will open a column on the right side of your screen. We've placed registration links for several upcoming live stream programs hosted on Gramercy Books, and I'll just tell you three of them. On Thursday, May 20th, at 7 p.m., New York Times bestselling author of The Paris Wife, Paula McLean, she launches her propulsive tour de force of literary suspense, When the Stars Go Dark. Paula will be in conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of The Daughters of Erie-Town, Connie Schultz. On Sunday, May 30th at 1 p.m., we feature 98-year-old Selma Vanderpeer and her gripping and powerful World War II memoir, My Name is Selma. Selma was a Dutch resistance fighter and Ravensbrück concentration camp survivor. She will be interviewed by noted Ohio State University historian, Dr. Robin Judd. Finally, on Thursday, June 3rd at 7 p.m., award-winning journalist Alex McGillis will be in conversation with Columbus Business First editor-in-chief Doug Buchanan to discuss fulfillment, winning and losing in one-click America. This is Alex's literary investigation of Amazon's impact on the wealth and poverty of towns and cities across the country. We encourage you to click on the link for any of these programs to learn more about them, as well as to register if you'd like. You can sign up on our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, to receive our e-newsletter and learn more about all of Gramercy's exciting live stream programs. And now, on to tonight's program. 6 days after giving birth, a polar bear named Aurora got up and walked away from her den at the Columbus Zoo, leaving her tiny, squealing cub to fend for herself. Hours later, Aurora still hadn't returned. The cub was furless and blind, and with her temperature dropping dangerously, the zookeepers entrusted with her care felt they had no choice. They would have to raise one of the most dangerous predators in the world by hand. Over the next few weeks, a group of veterinarians and zookeepers worked around the clock to save the cub, whom they called Nora. In The Loneliest Polar Bear, Kale Williams explores the fraught relationship humans have with the natural world the exploitive and sinister causes of the environmental mess we find ourselves in, and how the fate of polar bears is not theirs alone. Kale Williams is a reporter at the Oregonian, Oregon Live, where he covers science and the environment. A native of the Bay Area, he previously reported for the San Francisco Chronicle. He shares a home with his wife, Rebecca, his two dogs, Goose and Beans, his cat, Torta, and his stepcat, Lucas. Kale, it's a thrill to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your memoir with our Central Ohio community.
I'm very excited to be here with the earliest and probably most passionate fan base that Nora has.
Thanks, Kale. And in conversation with Kale is Jason Cervenec. Jason is the Education and Outreach Director for the Bird Polar and Climate Research Center at The Ohio State University. Jason currently has 4 NSF-funded research projects and led the development of the Columbus Climate Adaptation Plan. In 2010, Jason taught high school science for 11 years, and during that time, he took part in a Fulbright teacher exchange in Mumbai, India, where he witnessed firsthand the challenges faced by much of the world's population. Jason, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and joining this important climate discussion with Kale Williams tonight.
Thank you, Linda, for the invitation.
And thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. Now a warm welcome to Kale Williams in conversation with Jason Cervenec.
So thank you for having me this evening and having this opportunity. I think it was a pleasure reading this book, especially with the close connection to Columbus, Ohio. And I think there's a lot of wonderful information that I wasn't expecting when I first picked it up. I hadn't read any of the reviews. That was really nice to see woven into the book. I would like to remind the audience this evening, the person facilitating this evening will be trying to get as many questions to Kale from the audience. So throughout the evening, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get those woven into the conversation. So Kale, my first question is, what was the journey of writing this book like? How did you end up landing on The Loneliest Polar Bear and the connection to Nora? And then how did you weave all these other threads into the tapestry that became the book?
Yeah, it was a bit of a roller coaster. Nora first came to my attention. I was working as a reporter at the Oregonian in 2016, September, I think it was, when she first came to Portland. She had been born 10 months before that. And as Linda laid out, she was abandoned by her mom and raised by zookeepers. She was moved to the Portland Zoo when she was about 10 months old. And so my editor said, this is a baby polar bear. Sounds like it's got an interesting backstory. Let's try to learn a little bit more about her. So I went up and talked to the folks at the zoo, and they kind of laid out what they knew of her early months. And I went back to my editor and I said, this sounds like it could potentially be a larger story, but I'm not really sure what direction to go with it. And he suggested that I try tracing Nora's lineage back to the last time anyone in her family had been in the wild. So I got in touch with the folks in Columbus and started asking about Aurora, her mom. Her mom had been born in a zoo, and both of her mom's parents, I believe, had also been born in a zoo. But they told me that her father, a bear named Nanook, had been orphaned as a cub in the wild. They didn't know much more about it, so I started tracing Nanook's history back through all the zoos that he had been in. He was, I think, about 29 years old at that point, and he'd been at a zoo in Buffalo, New York, and another zoo in Wisconsin. And one of the keepers who had taken care of him as a youngster in Wisconsin told me that he had been something to do with a hunter in Alaska, had rescued him, and he knew generally that it was about 1988. So I got in touch with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service up in Alaska, asked them to dig through their archives, and they had a press release from March of 1988 that said a native Alaskan hunter from the village of Wales, which is just about on the westernmost tip of Alaska, had fallen through the roof of a polar bear den, landed on top of the mother bear, killed her in self-defense, and then rescued the 2 cubs, one of which would grow up to be Nanook.
So when you made that call up there to pursue that story, what kind of response did you get?
So there were a few steps between me getting a hold of that press release and me getting in touch with the hunter, whose name is Gene Agnabugak. Wales is a village of about 150 people. Very small, very remote. It's not on the road system, so the only way to get there is either by plane or by boat. And so I was a little stuck for a little while. I was using all the normal resources reporters do to try to locate people. We actually had a crackerjack researcher at the newspaper at that point, and I enlisted her help, a woman named Lynn Palumbo. And she was able to track down a few numbers up there. And in a village of 150 people, if you can get a hold of one person, you can probably ask them the number of somebody else and they'll likely have it. And that's eventually what happened. I ended up calling the village tribal office and saying, hey, is Gene Agnabugak still around? And they said, oh yeah, Gene. And they gave me his number. And I called him up and I said, are you the guy who fell into a polar bear den about 30 years ago? And he said, yeah, you want to hear the story? And I said, I do. And that was the first of many times that he told it to me.
And when you converse with him, is this something that he'd been asked about since, or really had been something that story came out 30 years past and nobody really asked about it between then and now?
No, he is well known in the village as the guy with the polar bear story. When I ended up going up there to interview him in person the first time, I was one of very few white people in the village. And so a lot of people were like, hey, what are you doing here? And it's like, oh, I'm a reporter. I'm here to talk to Gene. And they said, oh, about the polar bear. Everybody knew. It's a bit of a local legend.
Okay. So there's other threads that are woven in here. There's the story of climate change. There's the story of a changing Arctic. There's the indigenous communities there and kind of an unpacking of some of the history there. There's Nora herself and the role of zoos. So how did all those other threads get woven in?
Well, with a lot of work and editing and rewriting and moving things around, I mean, it was really important to me to examine how we got to where we are. And so for me, it wasn't just about, how are polar bears doing in the Arctic today? It was, how did polar bears come to survive in the Arctic? And so I went back to when they split off from brown bears. There's some debate about exactly when it happened, but how they developed all these specialized adaptations to survive in a place like the Arctic. And I wanted to know the same thing about the people who live up there. I mean, to most of us, it seems like a pretty inhospitable place, but the people who live up there have done so successfully, have thrived in many cases for thousands of years. And so for me, it was about finding the beginning of these threads to find a way to weave them together into Nora's story. And really the connective tissue throughout the whole thing was that all of these things are linked. I mean, the changing of climate, the way that people have learned to live in the Arctic and everywhere else for that matter, the way that, polar bears have learned to hunt seals, the only prey that will sustain them with, 1,000 calories per day that they need. All of those things, the link between all of them was really important to me.
So the Arctic's one of the fastest changing parts of the planet. It's an area where you have about a 6-degree temperature increase already from industrialization to now. You have dramatic physical changes happening, biological changes, societal changes with the humans that live up there. So what stood out from writing in the book that you really want kind of this larger community to know about? What things really jumped out at you that you think the American populace doesn't realize their connection to, but we are pretty closely coupled to what's happening up there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. The way that they live is different from, most of us in the lower 48 states live. But they, in many ways, are not so different from many rural communities. It's a small community. They rely on the land like a farmer or a hunter anywhere else would. And they've learned to do that over thousands of years of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. They've very much learned to read the land and the sea and the sky to know what's coming. They know the migration patterns of the prey animals that come by. And so all of that is predicated on a relatively stable climate. And I think what put it most into perspective for me, the first time I went up to see Gene was in March of 2017. And it was what you would expect for a town that's pretty close to the Arctic Circle. It was, I think, about 20 degrees below zero with the wind chill. There was sea ice that stretched out about a mile from shore. It was very cold, as I expected it to be. I went up there the same time of year in March of 2019, and it was raining. It was about 35 degrees, and there was no sea ice there. And, while one warm winter, you can't pin climate change to one distinct weather event like that. It's indicative of all the changes that, all climate experts have been forecasting for decades. And so when you have a village like that where their survival, their ability to hunt is predicated on thousands of years of knowledge that's been built up based on a consistent climate, and then it changes over the course of a couple decades. That throws everything out of whack. And that much is true not just for people in the Arctic, but for all of us. I mean, we're seeing floods that are 100-year floods every few years. We're seeing fires in my home state of Oregon every 4 or 5 years that used to happen every 80 or 90. And so this way of life that we've all become accustomed to, the infrastructure that we've built, our commerce, pretty much everything is just not built to withstand change at such a rapid pace.
Yeah, some of my colleagues would call these canaries in the coal mine, that many of those communities up there have really been the first to have to deal with problems that all of us will face in a more profound way, but it's just been amplified so much more rapidly there. Just out of curiosity, the choice to go there in March, I'm curious about that. That's not the time of year I would have thought. Was news coverage quieter at that time, or why the choice to go up there in the winter?
We wanted to get up there as quickly as we could. This was a project that I worked on for 10 months, but when I worked on the series for the newspaper that the book is based on, but even with a 10-month runway, we still had a deadline. So we wanted to do that as quickly as we could. The other thing was that, when Gene originally fell into the polar bear den was in March. And so I wanted to see what it looked like up there at the same time of year as when he went out, and I would ask, is this what it looked like, on that day at the end of March in 1988? And he said, yeah, it was pretty similar to this. That was not true when I went up there in 2019, obviously, but it was in 2017.
Yeah, and I appreciate your unpacking of the Indigenous knowledge in the book. We've done some youth exchange between Ohio youth and Alaska youth. And one of the things that's the most surprising is for youth in Ohio, the way that people subsist, they're accustomed to thinking about row crops and agriculture as we do in Ohio. And it's so different there that asking that question of youth in Alaska is foreign. It doesn't make sense because they're so accustomed to living off the land with different vegetables and fruits and berries and things like that.
Yeah.
So kind of switching gears a little bit with the zoo perspective, as you started to work with different individuals in the zoo community and kind of unpacking the role there. I know myself as an educator, I think when I first started teaching, I saw the zoo as a place to educate a bit, but there was entertainment. And then as you dive into it, there's species management plans now, there's research initiatives, there's habitat restoration, there's fundraising with all of that. So what's that journey look like as you start to figure out the kind of the greater mission of the zoo that is beneath this maybe icing on the cake and kind of core to their values and how they operate now?
Yeah, the idea of animals in captivity was a complicated one for me, and one that I sort of wrestled with. I mean, as a youngster, I have fond memories of going to the zoo and seeing these exotic animals that, you never get a chance to see in any other scenario. But as I got older and started thinking about, animal welfare issues more and, reading up on some, philosophy of animal cognition, I started being a little more troubled by zoos, and wondering how the animals that are there are actually faring. But zoos have also come a long way. For a long time, they were mostly just places of entertainment. And I got to say this with the caveat of zoos exist on a spectrum from, the Tiger King style roadside attractions, which are purely entertainment, have very little concern about animal welfare, to places like the Columbus Zoo and the Oregon Zoo and the zoo in Utah where Nora lived, that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, held to a much higher standard, really care about the welfare of the animals that they have there. But throughout the book, I sort of went back and forth, and I've been asked before in talks like this, where do you land? Do you see zoos as a net good or a net bad? And there's just not really a simple answer. I think it's a ethical scale that everybody has to put different weight on different things. I mean, if you think about strictly the welfare of the animals, I mean, polar bears roam for hundreds of miles in the wild. Their brains are stimulated by hunting and mating and defending themselves and making sure they have something to eat. And they just don't get that in zoos. Even the most expansive polar bear habitats are tiny fractions of their their natural range. And the same is true for other big, charismatic, intelligent animals like elephants and primates and things like that. But zoos are also places of conservation science and education. I mean, after the book came out, I've received emails from people who say, I was inspired by seeing Nora as a youngster, and I'm now studying to be a veterinarian or a wildlife biologist. It's hard to go to a polar bear exhibit in a zoo without seeing signage about ways that you can shrink your carbon footprint. So if you put that on the scale on one side, and then you have, the animal welfare on the other, it's sort of up to you which one of those you value more as an individual. The thing about the conservation aspect, zoos will tell you that, they hope to inspire their visitors to take action or, become more involved in whatever cause may be associated with a specific species. But that's really difficult to measure. I mean, inspiration is not the most tangible idea. And so, animal rights activists will tell you that that's all hogwash, and that, there's no way that these animals can possibly be doing as well as they could be elsewhere. At the same time, you can't really take like an animal like Nora and plop her out on the sea ice and expect her to survive. She was raised in a zoo. She does not know how to hunt seals. So it's a very complicated question, and people have kind of accused me of not really taking a side in the book, and I am guilty of that. Depending on the day and the last person I talk to, I come down on different sides of that question.
Yeah, the polar frontiers at the Columbus Zoo is a far cry from, in Toledo, where I grew up, it's a phenomenal zoo, but the installation was radically different 30 years in time. A cement enclosure with a moat and very little interaction and enrichment versus what Columbus has. Yeah. So as you talk to the polar bear conservation community, and they work closely with zoos and educational initiatives around the country, what do they see as the short-term and long-term future for polar bear conservation? Where is their real focus? And maybe what did you hear as maybe concerns or threats they have going forward? Things that really worry them.
Well, that's the thing about polar bear conservation. I mean, it's a problem that does not belong to polar bears alone. I mean, their biggest threat is climate change and rapidly diminishing sea ice. And that is a symptom of global warming, which is not, it's not the same as, making sure that palm oil plantations don't expand in the native habitats of elephants, where you can have a very defined goal, work to meet that goal. And once that goal is met, you're like, okay, these elephants have more space to live. It's not like that with polar bears, because climate change is a global problem that is caused by numerous different factors. I mean, obviously, to simplify it, it's accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But I mean, that comes from so many different sources throughout the global economy that you can't really just say, we need to do this one thing and polar bears will be okay. So, I mean, that's what makes it so tricky. And that's why they've been kind of anointed as the face of climate change, because they are a big, charismatic animal that can forge bonds with people and, in theory, motivate people to change their behavior. But, to get back to your question about the prognosis, it's a little more nuanced than they are all going to go extinct soon. There's 19 different subpopulations of polar bears kind of all around the Arctic. Some of them are declining. Some of them are thought to be stable. Others are thought to be increasing. But that's in the short term. The most recent research that I've read, a study that came out last year, said that I think it was about 80% of the subpopulations up there are expected to start experiencing reproductive failure by 2040 or the middle of the century. And that by the end of the century, all but a very small pocket of bears will likely be functionally extinct.
Did you find that part challenging when writing it? Because I appreciated the fact that there's a lot that's not known, and there's so many distinctions between those subpopulations. Some of them have been studied in great detail and some haven't. You as an author, when you start diving into that, did you expect there was a pretty straightforward or two narratives here, and then you find out you have to try to unpack this is really messy and we don't know a lot about the population dynamics in any one of these groups?
Yeah, I mean, It's certainly, I don't want to say it caught me by surprise, because as a reporter, I've kind of learned that anything that you think is simple probably has a lot more nuance behind it if you just dig deep enough. Um, but I mean, that's the problem. I've been a newspaper reporter where I've, written daily stories about climate change, and polar bears are a convenient ambassador. Like I said, they're big, they're cute, they're intelligent, they're intriguing. But it is a lot messier than that. There are a couple populations, that the southernmost ones that are the easiest to study, that there has been a lot of research on. Southern Hudson Bay, Western Hudson Bay, the northern Beaufort Sea off the north coast of Canada and Alaska, and the Chukchi Sea, where Nora's ancestors hail from, have all been studied relatively extensively. But, up on the very top of the world, on the Arctic Ocean, off the north coast of Siberia, a lot of those bears have never really been studied at all. It's just too remote. It's too dark for too long, too much of the year. And so there's just not much known, which, climate deniers can then see those openings as, a way to dismiss any sort of conclusions that are drawn about polar bears.
Yeah, when it's more of a limit on us as humans being able to observe throughout the year, or even having the technology until recently to try to do that. Stuff that survives in those conditions and give us data.
Yep.
So what, you do local science coverage as well. So what are compelling narratives you find for Oregonians? I can think about what things are like in Ohio, but often when I first started at the Bird Center, we really focused on kind of these charismatic large animals in the Arctic. And I found out for some people, those are really good ambassadors. But there's other ambassadors that sometimes are more compelling. And we've also found out that sometimes people's hobbies connect. So what speaks to people in Oregon? And is this something where Nora really does speak to that audience? But what are some other narratives that you found effective? And I guess maybe what pushback do you get, or common things you get from your readers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that polar bears are good ambassadors in the abstract. People tend to think of them as very separate and distinct from their lives. You're never going to see a polar bear driving down the street of Columbus, Ohio, or Portland, Oregon. But increasingly, you have not had to look far for the tentacles of climate change reaching into the daily lives of people in Oregon. Just over the last year, I mean, we had these massive wildfires over the summer, more acreage burnt than any time in recorded history here in Oregon, fueled by these east winds that came over the Cascade Mountain Range, and exacerbated by, years of drought. I mean, we are a state that is very wet on the western side and very dry on the eastern side because of the Cascade Mountain Range. And when these winds came through, they were whipping through forests that were drier than they've been in a long time. I mean, obviously, there are other factors that play into wildfires. We've been aggressively suppressing them for 100 years in places that would have burned naturally, and things like that. But then within a few months, we got this freak ice storm. It came right around the same time as Texas had that big freeze where, the jet stream that usually keeps the cold air up in the Arctic weakened just enough for some of it to leak out. And over the course of 4 days, we had, I think, 1.5 to 2 or 2.5 inches of ice that knocked out power to 500,000 people here in Oregon. And we didn't get the headlines, deservedly, that Texas did, because their problems were much more widespread. But I mean, it was a terrible time for a lot of people here. There were people who died of carbon monoxide poisoning when they were trying to heat their homes. There were people who went without showers or heat for 2 weeks or so. And it kind of gets back to what I think is the most important takeaway, in that, this problem was the problem of climate change. The worst ramifications are going to fall on the shoulders of the people least likely to be able to deal with it. If the power goes out at your house because of an ice storm and you have the resources to go stay in a hotel where there's electricity, you're probably going to be okay. You're going to be inconvenienced. But if you can't afford to leave your house and you can't afford the gas for a generator, then you're going to be very cold for 2 weeks, or you're going to resort to using, a space heater inside, and you're going to run the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yeah, that's an important point to make. And I think, some of my peers are actually putting in research proposals right now to look at this effect of the jet stream, as you have a warming of the Arctic that's so great, 6 degrees already. and a jet stream that's weakening, what does that mean for these cold outbursts that cause events like that, that maybe aren't what we would typically expect for climate change, but can really have an adverse effect in infrastructure if we don't plan for them, and are a result of us burning things.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most fascinating parts about the book. You know, like I had a vague idea of the way that thermal circulation works around the planet, but just to see, you know, like from what I understand, and you know this stuff better than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the jet stream essentially functions because there's a temperature gradient. It's, you know, cold below or cold above and hot below. And so that powers these super fast winds that usually run around, you know, the Canadian border. But when that gradient lessens, when it's warmer up above and, you know, still kind of warm below, then it can kind of zigzag, and that allows cold air to escape from the Arctic and sort of get stuck. And that's why you have these long periods of cold and, you know, hot in other places like the Arctic. And it's just fascinating because the same thing goes on with thermal circulation in the ocean. And that's why you see some recent research that's showing that, you know, some of the big circulating systems in the ocean that bring warm water from the equator up to the North Atlantic are slowing down, which, you know, is just going to be devastating if it continues.
Yeah, we've had, you know, areas of Siberia that were 80 and 90 degrees last summer, and you know, things that are very different than, as Catherine Hayhoe, one climate communicator and researcher, says, weather weirding, as you were seeing, is one of the signatures. We did have a question come in from Chris. Along the lines of effective communication, as a reporter, you have a unique lens through which to view climate communications. Climate change has, like many other topics, become political. Beyond trying to come up with ways to connect with people personally, can you see broadly how we can effectively communicate the climate crisis in a way that promotes progress, either through advancing policies like limiting fossil fuel production or investing in clean technologies? What advice would you give?
You know, I don't know if it's a matter of communicating it more effectively. I was talking to a man who actually worked in the Obama administration when they were crafting the Paris Climate Accord. This didn't actually make it into the book, but I asked him, I was like, what else do we need to do to, you know, convince the people who don't believe? And he said that we've gotten to the point where we don't need to convince anybody who doesn't believe. We need to convince the people who do believe to make it a higher priority. You know, and in terms of how to effectively reshuffle people's priorities, I mean, I think that it just needs to hit home that these are not threats posed to far off communities like people in Wales. These are threats that are going to, in the best case, be very inconvenient for everyone. And in the worst case, are going to be deadly for lots of people, especially poor people, the impoverished, people of color who have already been historically marginalized. And so for those of us who don't fall into those groups, the moral imperative is on us, because, you know, we have benefited from the systems that have caused climate change. Burning fossil fuels has produced the biggest and richest economy in the history of the world, and a lot of us have benefited from that. And so for us to say that the problem is too big, the problem is not solvable, and to throw up our hands is to kind of shirk our responsibility that we have to those people who aren't in a position of privilege like we are.
It's interesting you say that, because in the Six America study that was done, even looks at Ohioans and say 75% of Ohioans are in a position to either be in great concern of climate change or in this middle space where they're amiable to a conversation and maybe are concerned about it, but they're still grappling with what they know and don't know. But yet there's really widespread acceptance. All the surveying said nobody's talking about it. So it's interesting, as we talk to young people, you know, most people are in a space that are willing to act, especially on renewables and things like that. They're actually concerned, but there's no conversation even happening. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but these, like, you have an emissary through a polar bear that could maybe stoke that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's going to change, and probably sooner than later. A couple of the folks that I talked to in the latter chapters of the book were youth climate activists, and they are pissed off, and I don't blame them. You know, they see themselves very literally fighting for their future. I'm turning 40 soon. And so, I'll live 30, maybe 40 more years, 50 if I'm lucky. And so, if things continue as they do now, I will see some of the worst impacts of climate change just beginning by the time I hit the end of my rope. But, if you're 15 right now and you've got, 70 years in front of you, like there's some very bad stuff coming down the pike. And for them, it seems like a lot of older folks, my age and up, have sort of been like, well, it's your problem. And so they're pissed off, and I don't blame them for it. And I think that they are going to be forcing a lot more tough conversations. That being said, I don't think that we should leave it to them to do so. A lot of times they are condescended to. I talked to Jamie Margolin, who, after I was done reporting on the book, I saw her in conversation with John Kasich. And, he just kept saying, I really admire your passion, which is just so infantilizing to people who, really feel like they are under threat. So it really does have to be on all of us to raise our voices and make this more of a priority.
Did you find when you did this series in the paper that for us, we talk about a lot of local connections and like I mentioned, Arctic species that are large can be captivating for youth. Did you get a lot of audience engagement that you felt were able to see the deeper story, using that as kind of a hook to pull them in?
I did. It was quite well received. Not only just on an individual reader basis, but for the series, we made a children's book. I had a number of teachers that reached out to me saying that they were going to incorporate Nora's story into their curriculum. I'm actually going to be talking to a high school class in a few weeks here in Oregon. Sorry, 8th grade class here in Oregon. I've talked to a couple undergraduate classes. So I think that people did connect with Nora's story, but I hope that they connected with Jean's story just as much. I mean, I think that I don't want to say it's a gimmick to use animals to kind of hook people and reel them in and then be like, ha, gotcha. Now let's talk about climate change, because people should care about the effects on people too. And I mean, one of the reasons that I like reporting on animals is because you can openly root for them as, an objective reporter. You're not supposed to take sides, but you can openly root for an animal. And so I think that same kind of thing happens when you use them as ambassadors for climate change. They don't have any of the fallibility of people. You can look at the people who live in Wales and say, well, their power plant runs on diesel and they're all jetting around on 4-stroke ski mobiles, like there's none of that fallibility with an animal. But I don't think that means that people should care any less about the human impacts of this problem.
Well, as a reader, and we're going to go to Beth's question in a second, I appreciated how much science got unpacked. It started in chapter 2, but I wasn't, when I started out the book, I had read no background. I was really expecting just the story of Nora. And as I saw these other dynamics start to come out, I thought it was really an effective way to loop somebody in by one interest and realize, no, this is connected to so many other things, but you may not be aware of it. And there's a real vulnerability here for that hobby or interest if nothing is done of it. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
With that, we'll go to Beth's question. Do you have any insight on how the moves affected Nora as she went from zoo to zoo?
Well, yes and no. Somewhat limited insight. I know that when she moved from Columbus to Oregon, that move was necessary because the zookeepers had a suspicion that Aurora was pregnant again. They knew that, Aurora was not interested in defending Nora, and that Aurora needed the space that Nora was occupying. And at that point, Nora had pretty much only been with humans. She had been able to see and hear and smell the other bears, all very important sensory exposure, but she had only been with people. And so they wanted her to have a mentor of sorts of her own species. And so, I don't think that the move was stress-free. She was flown on a FedEx plane with a keeper in a travel crate. She was mildly sedated, and one of her keepers from Columbus traveled with her to Oregon, so she'd have some familiarity when she got there. but she did have mental struggles pretty much as soon as that keeper left, and ended up needing to be put on some antidepressants and some anti-anxiety medication. And then the bear that she was brought to be a mentor with in Oregon ended up passing away, a bear named Tossel, who was also very old, and was euthanized within a couple months of Nora arriving. So she was again alone and needed to be with another bear. So it was at that point that they recognized that Hope, a bear from the Toledo Zoo, also in Ohio, was moving to Utah, and the two of them could be paired up. So in those cases, all of those moves, while possibly stressful for Nora, were with the greater good in mind. And she ended up thriving in Utah. She had a great relationship with Hope after they got used to each other. Fast forward to a couple months ago, and Hope was moved to another zoo to breed, I believe in Chicago. And so at that point, they were bringing a larger male bear into the zoo in Utah, and Oregon just happened to have finished construction on this big, expansive, brand new state-of-the-art polar bear exhibit. So again, at that time she was moved by truck, not a short drive, but she was mildly sedated and she was used to traveling at that point. And so she's now in Oregon again in this big, beautiful exhibit, and getting ready to help researchers there study polar bear behavior so that they can better kind of decipher what's going on with polar bears in the wild. So I don't think that each trip in and of itself as an individual act was fun for Nora. I think all of them have resulted in a better life for her in the larger picture.
And that was something I was going to ask, is you've obviously interviewed a lot of the vets and staff and docents and people that have cared for her and been involved in educational programs. What is do you know what the species management plan is for her, or like breeding or studies like that to help inform polar bears? Is any of that stuff that's disclosed, or is that kind of shielded where you didn't really hear much of what that long-term plan is?
I never had access to like the species survival plan. I don't know that it's like one big binder of a document, but I've talked to the folks up at the Oregon Zoo since Nora has come back. They do not have any plans to breed her. She had metabolic bone disease as a youngster and still has some skeletal issues. She walks with a kind of sort of a funny gait with her elbows out, and she's expected to develop early onset arthritis. So she's not a great candidate for breeding. But moreover, the folks at the Oregon Zoo say that even with their big new facility, they're not super interested in breeding polar bears there. They said that they could, reconfigure things to set up a den area, but they're much more interested in conservation science. And they've kind of been on the forefront of that for almost a decade now. Tossel, the bear I mentioned earlier, was one of the first bears to voluntarily give blood without being sedated. Being sedated can be a traumatic experience for bears and for keepers alike. And so they trained her with the use of positive reinforcement, giving her food that she liked, to present her paw and voluntarily give blood, which means that they can do analysis of all of that much more frequently. They also trained her to walk on a treadmill in a hyperbaric chamber, hyperbaric, so that they could measure their oxygen intake during different activities, whether it's walking or running. And they built actually one of these, a swim flume inside one, so they could measure their oxygen intake and output while they're swimming, so that they know how much energy they're expending when they have to swim much farther between pieces of sea ice to hunt seals, which really informs how they go about their daily lives in the wild. And they're planning to do much more of that at the Oregon Zoo. I think that they said that one of the U.S. Geological Survey researchers had already started drafting permits to conduct some of that research with Nora.
Yeah, I think reading those sections of the book, everything from the veterinary size Prozac, I think was one of the medications that was given, to the studies on metabolism, to even the issue with her diet when she's young, where it reminded me how much of the biology I studied as an undergraduate is based on overall ideas, but we generalize what we know about one or two species to many species, and can then come to find out we really don't know how to reproduce the diet of an animal that lives in a far off place and feeds on one food source. And like between the medication, that, and how you talked about metabolism, it's like we don't know a lot about this animal, even if we're really close to it.
I mean, even more specifically, like, yes, with the species, but even down to individual animals. I mean, the recipe that they had for Nora's formula was one that had worked with another bear. Perhaps it was from a different, genetic subpopulation where it could have used the fat source that they used originally in her formula. But because Nora was not genetically programmed to ingest the nutrients she needed with that fat source, she didn't. And her bones ended up messed up at a very young age. They quickly changed the fat source and it ended up, kind of righting the ship, but not before some lasting damage was done. So it's not even just across species. It's, from individual to individual within species.
So Mary asked, have you kept up with the Columbus Keepers and veterinary team and seen Aurora's other offsprings in your reporting?
I follow the Columbus Zoo on Facebook, but that's about the extent. During the reporting of the book, I would check in periodically and see that Aurora had, given birth to another set of cubs and was raising them successfully, which was great to see. But I have not been following them super closely. I was pretty focused on Nora and her journey.
So as an author, what is your next project or two? Are there things on the horizon that have come across during this or other topics you're researching, series, another book on the horizon?
I've got some seeds in my head that have planted and I think are probably sending roots out, but haven't quite poked their leaves above the soil, to really stretch the use of a metaphor there. So I don't know if I'm quite ready to talk about that yet. I mean, I think over this last year, just putting one foot in front of the other has been enough. It's been a tough year just to exist. It's been a very difficult year to be in the news industry. I was reporting on the pandemic for several months and, it's just been a very heavy year. And I think as we start to kind of poke our heads out from the rocks we've all been under for so long, I'm kind of trying to take some time to appreciate the sunshine, to overuse yet another metaphor.
So for your team, the science reporters, the paper, what did the pandemic bring you that was, I guess, most different or most challenging? And then is there anything you walk away from that with that your team plans to keep that was particularly effective?
It's hard to answer. One of the things that struck me were some of the parallels between the denial of science from climate change to the coronavirus. And obviously the evolution of climate science has taken place over a much longer period of time. The science around the coronavirus was developing day by day, sometimes hour by hour. But you saw the same kind of themes where the credibility of institutions that has long been thought of as resolute was being undercut for various reasons. I mean, we know why in climate change. It's for profit from oil companies, amongst other lesser causes. And I mean, I think that some of it, in the case of the pandemic, can be tied to greed as well. But I mean, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, because I think one of the most important takeaways that we have from that is that, and this has been known but was put into stark relief by the pandemic, is that when bad things happen, they are going to be worst for the most vulnerable among us. And that's why you see higher rates of infection and death among people of color, people of lower income, people who have been historically marginalized. And I think as reporters, it's our responsibility to make those types of effects as known as we possibly can, because when they're unknown, there's no way to take action on them. I think that's the biggest takeaway that stuck with me.
No, I think your observation is astute, and I think my peers I work with agree. I think many of us sat here before the pandemic saying, well, if there was a crisis in the health community, if there was a pandemic, this would be responded to with overwhelming support, and really we would rally behind it. It'd be a good model to help us inform how to respond to climate change. And then as months ticked off, we started to realize, oh no, the same playbook's going to get deployed here. And we kind of watched the health sciences community go through it. And we knew we had gone through over a long period of time in really slow pace the exact same playbook that was used, and kind of felt sorry for them having to respond in real time, and some really having a great communications platform and doing everything right and still not getting the response we expected it would. And then it's made us reflect maybe how much harder our work is going to be trying to convey information.
Indeed.
We had a question come in from Fran asking how Gene is and has he ever been able to meet Nora?
Gene is doing well. I talked to him a few weeks ago. I'm not sure if anyone here was paying attention to the vaccination push up in Alaska, but they were the fastest state to get widespread acceptance. And a lot of that is because of these close-knit tribal communities. They have so much respect and value for their elders there that they were just, give me the shot. He got his vaccine several weeks ago. They didn't have any cases of COVID-19 in Wales whatsoever throughout the pandemic. So that was really good news to hear. Gene does not travel much. He doesn't have a ton of money. And so when he does travel, it's usually to Nome, which is a town of about 3,000, 4,000 people. It's about an hour plane ride away. So he has not gotten a chance to meet Nora. He has seen pictures of her and takes great delight in the fact that, this polar bear cub that he brought home to his living room in 1988 ended up being this bear that has become this, for lack of a better term, internet celebrity. So he takes great pride in that. But no, he has not been able to meet her in person.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because once again, last summer when we were kind of talking to youth in Alaska, so many of those communities were hit by the Spanish flu pandemic, the 1918 pandemic, and they never really forgot it. And here we'd had to go back and look at news clippings, and their communities and elders still spoke of how it decimated villages and how they never recovered. So when this one happened, there was a pretty rapid shutdown of stuff, and we saw very little travel, and then a lot of those tribal groups making decisions to really protect the community because the memory had never lapsed.
Yeah, I think that, when your history is an oral one that is passed from generation to generation, you tend to remember things like that a lot better than, if it's written in a newspaper clipping from 1918 that you have to Google to then go dig up. I don't know a lot of people who spoke to their grandparents or great-grandparents about the Spanish flu. But like you said, it is not so far removed from the history of the people up there in Alaska.
So we have about 2 minutes left. So we had one more question come in. After the recharge, are there other research projects you want to pursue? And I guess to also add a little spin to that, is there anything you walk away from this book with that was like a real aha, didn't expect to come across that, or anything that was really, really challenging that you didn't expect you'd have to deal with? And like you said, maybe as a reporter, maybe you're not surprised by anything at this point.
Oh, I'm surprised all the time, mostly because I try to approach every topic like I'm an idiot, and in many cases I am. So I try to approach it with an open mind, knowing that I know very little about it, and I think that's the best way to be a reporter. I focus on science and the environment, but I'm a bit of a generalist in my everyday work, and so I have a wide body of knowledge, but it's very shallow. And so I try to approach each assignment with, sort of the curiosity of a child, which is a bit of a cliche, but remains true. In terms of research, I'm very interested in extreme weather and disasters, and how we are going to go about adapting to a new reality where they are going to be much more frequent and much more severe. And part of that is probably I got my start as a breaking news reporter, and probably part of that is like the salacious, I want to be where the action is type of instinct that I have. But I mean, like I said, you've seen just over the last year in Texas, here in Oregon, with the freeze and the fires, the hurricanes on the Gulf Coast. I mean, these things are going to be part of our lives in a way that they haven't been in the past. And so I'm intrigued by our ability to adapt to them. I mean, climate change is going to take mitigation, reducing our fossil fuel emissions, but it's going to take a lot of adaptation too, because we've already gotten to the point where some of these changes are baked in. I mean, carbon dioxide does not dissipate quickly. And so where we are now is probably at best case scenario going to be a baseline, and worst case going to be a fond memory in a couple decades. So I'm very interested in how cities and societies and different cultures are going to adapt to a future that includes a lot more extreme weather.
Well, sadly, with 27 events last year, over $1 billion in costs, I don't think you'll have any shortage of events to cover or any shortage of topics within those. So go ahead and look at.
Certainly not.
Well, I know we've reached the 8 o'clock mark. So I would like to invite Linda back to make some concluding comments as we close out this evening.
And I'm back.
The magic of Zoom.
This was absolutely an illuminating conversation. I could have listened to another few hours of this. Thank you so much for a remarkable book, Kale, and opening our eyes to a lot of the issues that we must face today. And Jason, you know, your expertise showed in every question you asked, and we're very appreciative of you and of the Bird Center at Ohio State University. So thank you. And thanks very much to this audience, you know, for wonderful questions. And I think we have a lot to kind of chew on here. And just, you know, wanted to tell everyone to tell your friends about this book. You know, you need to tell other people. If you haven't bought this book yet, get the book. If you look in the chat box, you will see another link for The Loneliest Polar Bear. It's an important book for everyone to read. Just want to remind everyone, there's other links in the chat box for other programs coming up. You know, Gramercy Books is open every single day, 10 to 6, and we continue to provide curbside pickup, another part of the pandemic that we will continue. So thank you all for spending part of your evening with us. Thank you again, Kale and Jason, and we hope everyone joins us again soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.